a different kind of horror. Bertram Bertie Smythe was no stranger to horrifying things. As an aviator in the Great War, he had seen his fair share of misery, from the desperate existence of men in the trenches to daily inhumane acts as the conflict engulfed tens of thousands in mud, filth and blood. He'd soon come to realise that after seeing those horrible things, that there were no real victors or victims in war. There are only those forever fallen, the living and the dead. Whilst Bertie was fortunate enough to still be amongst the former, he continued to be haunted by the faces of the latter. However, even those unforgettable experiences, those memories and nightmares that had seared their way into his very soul, for he had not returned the same man by any means, paled into insignificance compared to the scene that played out before him now, like some cruel and twisted pantomime. Reality flickered before him, and his senses were pushed to their limit, to say nothing of his psyche. Stretched to the point of breaking, his mind was saved by the horrors he had endured over the sommeil that had so inured him that he did not go irrevocably insane on the spot. Even so, he felt his sanity begin to fray, his mind overloading as the impossible horror turned towards him, flailing and screaming. The evening had started like any other, in the pub. Ever since the war had ended, Bertie had struggled to reintegrate himself back into anything approaching a normal life. Though his sleep was far from peaceful, he had learned to deal with the nightmares and no longer woke in the middle of the night, screaming and covered in sweat. Physically, Bertie had been one of the lucky ones. Even though a pilot, he had still suffered his fair share of minor injuries with scars enough to impress the girls. His service had allowed him to remain largely unmaimed, still with all his limbs and digits. Bertie's injuries, however, went deeper than that. He was wounded inside and wasn't healing. Discharged from the Royal Flying Corps on grounds of ill health, Bertie had lost meaning to his life. Like many young men, he had thought war would be a grand adventure. Instead, Bertie lived a lifetime in the 4 short years he was in France, knowing only conflict and camaraderie. Yet, in the time since he had returned to England, he had been unable to hold down a steady job, frequently getting into fights and just listing from day to day, drinking and sleeping restlessly, waking at first light and repeating the ritual. Existing but not living. He could not shake the persistent feeling that something was very wrong with the world, something just out of his sight, an elusive hidden danger just at the periphery of his vision. He put this down to trauma from the war, that day over the front that he had seen something in the clouds. He still could not speak of that day and instead tried to carry on with his routine, although he could never shake the knowledge of there being something else, something unfathomable, other waiting for him out in the world. Drinking was easy to come by. He was, after all, a war hero. Bertie had committed many acts of valour during the war and was considered a hero in his village. Decorated though he was, he never wore his medals beyond the first month or so of his return to England, the continual attention irking him. Favours and gifts were nonetheless bestowed upon him, and combined with his saved army pay, he was by no means destitute. This may have been part of the problem. He did not need to try, to strive. He just idled by like driftwood on a stream. Some might have said that he had struggled enough, certainly his neighbours, who looked upon him with a mix of pity and concern. "There goes Joyce's boy," they'd lament. "Such a shame. Always such a shame." Worse than all of this was the violence inside him. Bertie had revelled in the destruction he could cause with his aircraft, strafing enemy entrenchments, catching infantry in the open, and laying waste to them with machine gun fire. The adrenaline rush got him through his first few encounters, but after that, it was the adrenaline that he craved. In the first few weeks after getting home, he would pick a fight with anyone. The anger and the need to lash out was just too great for him to keep inside. He pictured it as a darkness in his soul, a need to fight against the world just for something to slake his thirst for violence. After waking up in a cell of the local police station, he realized he needed to control his temper. He soon found that drinking helped, but not too much, or he would inevitably end up locked up for more than just a night, or dead in a gutter. Most evenings, Bertie sat alone, drinking solemnly in a secluded corner of the King's Arms. Precious few as they were, he would sometimes find him accompanied by a fellow survivor, drowning together in remembrance. He never really took part in the sing-alongs or revelry. Even the ladies that regularly approached his table had lost their allure after a time. That night he did have company. Peter Twitcher Jones had lost a leg in the war, a proper blighty and no mistake. All Tommies had coveted the blighty, a wound serious enough to get you sent home from the war, but not serious enough to be fatal, and Twitcher had caught a corker. A shell, just like any other, but this one was in the right place at the right time, and he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or was he? He'd caught the blighty, he'd gone home, albeit minus one of his legs. Bertie wasn't bitter about it. He didn't feel much of anything these days. No hatred, no honour, no pride. Just an overwhelming numbness. As usual, they drank to the dead, to Big John McCormick and to Sparks, to Cabbage Herbert and to Sniffles Bridges. Poor scrawny Sniffles had been just a boy, fated never to return, fated to die in the muck and sucking filth of the Sommet. Glasses were raised, the glorious dead toasted, and memories honoured. Those once loyal, now a row of crosses dotted on the fields of France, surrounded by blood-red poppies. They shared stories and reminisced, though Bertie's experience spanned a full 2 years more than Twitcher's. With the evening done, they parted ways, duty paid, dead friends done right. Bertie lit a rolled-up cigarette in his cupped hands as Twitcher hobbled off, crutch tip-tapping on the cobbles as he disappeared around the corner. Enjoying his cigarette, Bertie took a meandering route home. He still lived with his ma, his father cruelly having died the month before Bertie had returned from the war. Neither of his brothers had returned. Older and younger, both had perished, adding to the butcher's bill of the Great War. His ma had never been the same, each dreaded telegram leaving its heavy mark upon her soul. Becoming widowed had been the final straw. She was a cold, distant woman now, permanently ruined by grief and loss. Still, it was home, as much as anything was these days. It was safe, it was easy, and that was all Bertie really cared about. It was wandering down the third or fourth dark alley that Bertie had first heard the noise, a shuffling, scraping sound, accompanied by a rasping wheeze. At first he'd paid it no mind, probably a fellow inebriate, making their hesitant and faltering way home. But the sound continued, and it wasn't always behind him. Bertie looked about and then quickened his pace, foregoing lighting another cigarette. He wasn't overly worried. He could look after himself easily enough if things turned to violence, but something was unnerving about the sound. It didn't feel right. Then again, Bertie was not entirely sober, so it was probably just his mind playing tricks. Then something hit him from behind and he stumbled. The blow wasn't anything solid, more like a sudden gust of wind. Reflectively, his combat instincts had come to the fore and he turned the tumble into a roll, springing up and spinning about face, his fists bunched, ready to fight. No amount of combat experience could have prepared him for what he saw. The air in front of him had split. No, it had been torn. Reality was rent asunder before his very eyes, even as his intoxicated brain tried to comprehend what was happening. The tear had widened, and a sickening, unearthly light had spilled forth, illuminating the alley. A cat bolted noisily, but Bertie barely noticed. He could not have looked away if he tried. The edges of the rift rippled, and reality screamed as something forced its way through the rupture in space. The creature's large, glistening bulk pulsated as it heaved itself through the portal with an effort. Bertie had slowly backed away and lowered his fists. desperately wanting his trusty Webley in his hands and almost wishing he was in the death-filled skies above the Sommet. Anywhere would be better than being near this abomination. The thing was through the fracture in its entirety now. It had lain momentarily, quivering and undulating, then pulled itself upright. It wheezed and rasped, and Bertie realized with mounting horror that this was the thing that had been stalking him all along. Upright, it wasn't much taller than him, though it was certainly bulkier. It shimmered and glistened, appendages flailing, dripping an etheric ooze that splattered on the cobblestones. Bertie couldn't discern its actual colour, as the rippling light from the portal around it distorted its hue, patterns of light and shade flickering across its glistening skin. Slowly it turned, and as it did so, it screamed, though from where Bertie could not discern, for he could not see a mouth. It had eyes, though, and that was perhaps the most horrifying thing of all, for they gleamed with alien intelligence and comprehension, but above all, malevolence. What profane creation was this? Bertie felt his sanity begin to fray. Constantly pulsating and flailing, it shuffled towards him, all the while screaming and wailing. Bertie wanted to run. So desperately he wanted to turn tail and flee, but he was rooted to the spot. The thing had come closer now, close enough that he could smell its honey-like, sickly sweet odour. So close he could almost touch it. Resolve finally formed in Bertie's mind as the much-craved adrenaline began to hit his system, and with a scream of his own, he reached for the nearest functional weapon and struck out wildly. He grabbed a steel bar, and although he half expected it to pass through the monster, as if some sort of phantasm, the blow connected with solid, unyielding flesh. The thing recoiled, tentacles retracting slightly, as it shrank back from the strike. Emboldened, Bertie followed up with a more measured attack, striking for the right, and then from above, each blow eliciting an unearthly howl from the hulking beast. Snake-like, a tentacle whipped around and grasped the bar, ripping it from his grip. The beast surged forward and collided with him, knocking him from his feet. He lay sprawled on his back in the dirt, stunned and helpless, as the horrific entity bore down upon him. Bertie was no stranger to death. After all, most of his mates had been killed in front of him, and he himself had faced death more than he could count. He and death were old friends, but he was damned if he was going to die. He'd survived the Great War, and there was no way this creature was going to be the thing that ended him. He scooted back, grasping about him for another suitable weapon, bellowing obscenities at the horror as it lumbered and shuffled after him. His desperate fingers found a brick, but throwing it had appeared to have little impact. The brick bounced off the creature, with no discernible effect, eliciting nothing more than a hiss to interrupt the wailing. He needed something better. Inexorably, the monster came closer, and Bertie found himself backed up against a granite wall he didn't remember being there. A quivering tentacle touched Bertie's boot, pulling and coiling itself in a vice-like grip. Though he struggled mightily, Bertie was drawn steadily into the clutches of the unspeakable horror. Suddenly, there was a blur of movement. The tentacle that was constricting his leg erupted in a shower of blood, and the beast screeched in pain as its severed limb dropped to the ground. Bertie scrambled to his feet as the horror twisted to face a new threat. Another blur, and another cut appears across the creature, slicing whatever passes for its torso. The wound oozed a pallid luminescent ichor, and the beast wailed louder, impotently lashing out with its tentacle stump. As his senses re-established themselves, Bertie became aware of a hooded figure crouched atop a fence, silhouetted against the night sky. Suddenly it vaulted, and there was a flash of silver in the moonlight. The creature sliced open once again. Inexplicably, its wound began to quickly heal, he noticed. Within seconds, its slimy skin began knitting together, the photoplasmic flesh becoming whole once more. Even the stump of its severed tentacle had already healed over. At least it hadn't begun to regrow, as far as Bertie could tell. The horror's attacker made a leap back out of range, but stumbled on the discarded metal bar Bertie had used a moment ago. Sensing an opportunity, the creature lashed out, and there was a yelp of pain as his would-be rescuer was struck roughly to the cobblestone. They weren't down for long, bounding up and brandishing a pair of wickedly shimmering blades. Bertie studied this newcomer. It was a woman. He could discern that much straight away. She was slight, wearing some sort of cowl and light leather jacket and trousers like something out of a museum of medieval costumes. The weapons she wielded were unlike anything Bertie had ever seen, and the arcane-looking sigils upon the blades burned brightly in the gloom of the alleyway. Bertie stared in amazement. He'd never seen anyone like her. The figure was more cautious now, but still moved frighteningly fast, landing 2 swift strikes on the abomination in rapid succession. A second tentacle flopped lifelessly to the floor, but another had grasped and upended the battling figure despite her agility. She fell heavily to the ground with a grunt, one of the exotic weapons flying from her grasp, before recovering and springing to her feet once more, darting away from another attack from the flailing tentacles. Whilst guarding an attack from her right, she was exposed on the left, and she took another blow from a snaking appendage, again letting out a cry of pain. Bertie had seen enough fights to recognize an uneven one. Whatever advantage his rescuer had possessed was rapidly vanishing, and the struggle was now turning against them. Bertie swallowed, reached down and picked up the newcomer's fallen weapon that had become quiescent upon leaving its owner's grasp. It glowed dimly in his hand, though he could see no mechanism within, not that he was learned in such things in any way. It felt slightly warm to the touch, and although it shone, it was nowhere near as bright as it had been in the hands of the mysterious woman. He saw the strange icon carved into the blade was still present, but now unlit. He had no idea why. The nature of the weapon escaped him completely. Not that it mattered. No guts, no glory, old chum, he muttered bitterly to himself, and with a wild cry, on the edge of abandon, he hefted the weapon and charged. Bertie was not entirely unused to fighting with a blade. He'd had ample experience with a bayonet in basic training, and once he had even killed with an axe after bailing out close to enemy lines. This weapon, however, was completely different. It was the same weight and heft that would be expected, but its design was quite bizarre. It had a mid-length handle and a rippled wide blade that did not jut out at a right angle, but was offset from the handle, almost like an angular spearhead. It was like a short polearm or some dagger-axe hybrid. He'd certainly not used anything like it before. Still, it cut well enough, and even now he hewed at the creature, having decided to wield it for now as a rather odd axe. Now facing attacks from both sides, the creature reeled. It still struck out, but its strikes were getting feeble and slower, becoming easier to dodge. The monster quivered and drew back on itself as Bertie and his mysterious ally redoubled their attack, but it wasn't dying. Any wounds rent in its being healed swiftly, and though it was growing weaker, it just wouldn't die. What did he have to do to finish it? Bertie wondered. The woman glanced over, and he saw her eyes widen as she saw him wielding her weapon, the blade glowing softly like dying embers. "You can't kill it." Her voice was muffled, but he could hear the underlying pain in it. "We must drive it back into the portal. Once gone, I can seal the rift behind it." There was a pause as the woman fended off a couple of blows. "Trust me, I know it all too well. We cannot slay it. We can only send it back where it came from. Trapping it there, and that is hard enough." There was something else about her voice, but he couldn't quite place it. Still, he was a little preoccupied, truth be told. Between them, they drove the creature back, advancing step by step, raining coordinated strikes upon the horror. In the end, the thing wasn't really attacking at all, just trying to deflect their blows. With a final mewling noise, it slunk back into the glowing rift. Bertie wasn't inclined to let it depart intact, and hacked off one more tentacle as it withdrew through the portal. He looked down at it laying there, quivering, jerking spasmodically. The woman pulled a charm from her leather jerkin and performed a series of complex hand movements, accompanied by some muffled chanting that Bertie couldn't quite comprehend. The portal wavered and then closed, blinking out of existence, as if it had never been there. The severed tentacle instantly stopped moving and began to dissolve, not into a puddle of ichor, as Bertie had expected, but into nothingness, as if it had just evaporated. He stared dumbfounded as the only physical evidence of the encounter dissipated like a wisp of smoke. The woman staggered, clearly weakened by the feat, leant against a wall while she recovered. They stood silently in the gloom of the alleyway. Bertie felt on the verge of hysteria. Adrenaline was quickly leaving his system, and now his brain began asking questions that he found he was utterly unable to answer. Bertie suddenly remembered he was holding the weapon that only moments ago had been glowing strangely. He quickly opened his hand, and it fell to the ground, striking the cobblestones with an almost musical chime. The woman slowly replaced the charm back inside her clothing and breathed deeply, pushing back her hood with her free hand. Even in the wan moonlight, Bertie could see the way her red hair shone, and her face, though weary and pained, was classically beautiful. She bent down and retrieved the weapon that Bertie had dropped as he began spouting nonsensical words and syllables, desperately trying to ask questions, but failing miserably. He stared agog as she studied the blade curiously and secured both weapons on her belt before turning to look directly at him for the first time. Kind yet hardened eyes gazed intently as she extended a hand towards him. "The name's Agatha," she said by the way of introduction, in a littling Irish accent. "I'm sure you have many questions, but now is really not the time. Come with me. It's not safe here, and I have questions for you too." Her head tilted, quizzically, as if she were assessing him. Bertie dumbly took her hand as he pulled himself to his feet, mind reeling. "Come on," she repeated a little more insistently. "We have a lot to discuss, and I know just the place." As the roar of pounding blood in Bertie's ears subsided, he heard dogs barking and the people waking up, disturbed by the commotion. He fancied he could hear a policeman's whistle somewhere in the distance. They were both battered and bruised. Departing would be wise. Besides, he thought, the world was no longer the one he thought it was, and it could never be again. He had to have answers, and this stranger was the only chance of getting them. Bertie Smythe," he said, a measure of strength returning to his voice. Agatha smiled brightly. "Pleased to meet you, Bertie. Let's go." He simply nodded, and without another word, followed her into the night.